problems and motor problems. And we'll get into that. There are two that I want to talk about today because as far as I know, they're the only two standardized ones that are out there. The first of these is the Adult Adolescent Sensory Profile, good old Brown and Dunn's, and our ASH. Okay? So let's talk about these are the two measures, the sensory profile. So let's talk about the sensory profile. Sensory profile is 60 items, 5-point Likert scale, okay? It measures the frequency of responses to specific sensations. It is designed using the SPD model, okay? So you need to be aware of that. One of the things to be aware of with this tool is this was based off of the sensory profile. Katana Brown developed it as part of her doctoral thesis, okay, her doctoral dissertation. She adapted the children's questions for adults and did the preliminary test development based on that. One of the issues with both the children's sensory profile and this one is that the patterns of performance that came out of them and the original model of SPD originated from the factor analyses of the tool. So the tool generated the model, okay? And that's not normally the way you develop assessment tools.
And what frame of reference have Brown and Dunn based all of this on?
It was based on Dunn's sensory profile, sensory processing model, okay? The over and under responsivity, seeker, avoider. And what happened with the sensory profile, let's talk about the kids' sensory profile, because that's where this started. Winnie Dunn had a large NIH grant, okay? And please don't put this on the web. She had a large NIH grant to evaluate some functioning, and she needed a standardized assessment for sensory processing, and there were none at the time. So she developed the sensory profile to use in this as part of this grant, okay? So she developed the assessment tool for research purposes. It was not developed for clinical purposes. Now, as a result, she came up with a really strong, psychometrically sound assessment tool. But the problem was that in doing so, she eliminated many of the clinical factors that we find useful. So items like tags in shirts, dislikes hair brushing, all of these things, for instance, that, okay, if you have one of them, we don't worry about. But if you have a bunch of them, we know we have a problem. Well, she eliminated those items because she made each individual item on her test had to discriminate between groups. And those items don't discriminate between groups by themselves because we all sometimes are bothered by tags in shirts. Okay? So the choices she made around the test items. Also, because she wanted each item to discriminate, she ended up losing most of the discrimination items and motor items because as adults, or as kids, we adapt, right? And we can ultimately do things. We can do skill even if you have poor motor and sensory. So if tying your shoes was one of the items and you have fine motor problems, you still figure out how to tie your shoes, right? So that item didn't discriminate. So what ended up happening then was the sensory profile ends up having predominantly modulation items. Okay? Yeah. Predominantly modulation items. There are some postural items, but there's no motor praxis items, and there are very few discrimination items. Okay? So when she went to do her factor and cluster analyses, well, she wasn't covering the whole range of sensory integration, right? So her factors and clusters didn't come out matching I sat there in the very first presentation she did after she did this. And she's like, well, our tool didn't come out to match Ayres's model, so we had to come up with our own model. Well, of course it didn't match Ayres's model because she didn't ask the right questions, right? So she had to create a model. She had to come up with a model to explain her results, which is kind of backwards, right? And so that's where, well, we found that it really reflected sensory processing, over and under responsivity. And that's where this whole over and under responsivity and behavior, seeking and avoiding, okay? So she had to come up with a model to match this. So the adult one followed that same model, okay? And that's now where you get your 4 quadrants, okay? So the 4 quadrants ended up being low registration, sensory seeking, sensory sensitivity, and sensory avoiding, because 2 of them have to do with sensory threshold, over and under responsive, and 2 have to do with behavior in response to the threshold, okay? Yeah, okay. And from this then Lucy Miller then took this information, took Dunn's model and modified it a little bit and expanded it into the current SPD model. So the current SPD model that everybody's talking about originated with Dunn's model, okay? So when we talk about the clinical utility of this, what you're looking at here is over and under responsivity and seeking. So people can be high in more than one quadrant. They can be high in as many as 3 out of the 4 usually. All right. So what it does is it gives you a pattern of performance, but it does not give you a total score.
That's why I feel like I always come down to that imagination piece. So you're like, well, sometimes they can, and sometimes they can. And it's like you're saying that for everything. Student. That makes sense now. Like,
Yeah.
It's like, why is this so frustrating?
It's
Yeah.
very frustrating.
Yeah.
It's a very frustrating tool. It is published. It was standardized on 900 predominantly white Midwesterners. So there are some questions around the standardization, potentially.
Of yours?
No, this is
Still the adult. Oh, okay.
the sensory profile.
Okay,
This is the
okay.
sensory profile. Okay? And they categorize the responses. So the individual responses, your 4 quadrants are categorized as being distance from the normative mean. So, and basically it would have been so much easier if she just frickin' had said, what's 1 standard deviation above or below the mean and 2 standard deviations above or below the mean. That's what she means, okay? So when you look at it and it says, similar to most people is normal, and then it's less than most people is -1 to -2 standard deviations. Much less than most people is less than -2 standard deviations below the mean. And then much more, or more than some people is +1 to +2, and then +2 on up. It's just a bell curve. It's like, why she didn't use the numbers, I don't know. But that's what they ended up doing. But that people don't know how to interpret that information very effectively. Which if she just said, well, you're 2 standard deviations above the mean, and that's a dysfunction, that would have been
clear, I thought, in there. I knew that, so it must be in the book.
I'm sure it is, but most people have a hard time with that.
Oh, it's not on the chart, no, but it is in the book.
It might be on the chart, yeah. It's not on the chart,
No.
but I think it's in the
book,
text.
yeah.
Yeah. So, in any case, there's no total score though, and this is one of the frustrating things for people is they're not able to come up with a total score. And she says, well, that's its strength, is that it gives you a profile of performance. But as you said, what I have heard clinical application is that clinicians find it to be very weak clinically. Clinical utility and validity is often not great.